My name is Claire Reynolds. I'm 35 years old, and I learned a long time ago that in my family, I was the ghost at the table. I wasn't the black sheep. That would have required a level of passionate rebellion I never possessed. No, I was simply the transparent one, the quiet, serious daughter who didn't quite fit the vibrant, sun-drenched picture my parents wanted to paint of our lives. At my sister's engagement party, an event designed to be the masterpiece of her social career, she raised her glass of champagne. Her smile was perfect, her posture flawless, and in front of 100 guests, she decided to mock me. "Claire's just the boring one who hides in law books," she announced, her voice a tinkling bell of false affection. A wave of polite laughter rippled through the grand ballroom, the kind of gentle, dismissive laughter I'd been hearing my entire life, but this time was different. The laughter caught in people's throats when her fiancé, the handsome prince of this fairy tale, turned deathly pale. He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time all night, and whispered a question that shattered the illusion. "You're the judge?" But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Growing up in our large, rambling house in a Boston suburb was an early education in the physics of attention. It was a finite resource, a powerful energy that, in our home, flowed in only one direction, toward my younger sister, Lena. She was born sparkling, as if she had swallowed a star. While I came into the world with watchful, serious eyes and a mind that craved the quiet satisfaction of order and logic, Lena arrived with a laugh that could fill a room and a magnetic charm that bent the world to her will. Our parents were her first and most devoted audience, and they never tired of her performance. The dynamic was set so early that I have no memories of a time before it existed. One of the most vivid examples is etched in my mind from the year I turned 10. I had become obsessed with the citywide spelling bee. For months, our dining room table was my command center, covered in index cards on which I'd meticulously written thousands of words. The ink smudged my fingers, and I whispered definitions to myself as I walked to school. It was a solitary, intense pursuit, but I loved it. I loved the structure, the certainty. When I won, standing on a stuffy auditorium stage under hot lights, the large blue ribbon placed over my head felt like a coronation. I came home clutching the ribbon and a small, heavy trophy shaped like a golden book. I found my parents in the living room, their faces alight with excitement. My father was holding his expensive camera, snapping picture after picture. My mother was clapping, her eyes shining with pride. My heart swelled. They had heard. They were proud of me. But then I saw the object of their adoration. It was Lena, 8 years old, pirouetting in the center of the room in a frothy pink tutu and a tiara that kept slipping over one eye. She had won 3rd place in the Little Miss Sunshine local children's beauty pageant. "Oh, Claire, you're home," my mother said, her gaze flicking to me for a nanosecond before returning to Lena. She gestured vaguely at my trophy. "That's nice, dear. Look, isn't your sister just a star? The judges said she has natural stage presence. A real performer." The trophy, which had felt like the weight of a great accomplishment, suddenly felt like a lump of cheap metal. I mumbled a congratulations to Lena, who barely noticed, too busy practicing her pageant wave. I quietly took my prize to my room and set it on my desk, behind a stack of books. It gathered dust over the years. There was no photograph of me with my blue ribbon. That night, however, the family album gained a new, multi-page spread titled Lena's First Pageant, filled with glossy photos of her smiling, waving, and blowing kisses in her ridiculous tutu. My spelling bee, a victory of intellect and diligence, was never mentioned again. That was the pattern of our lives, a relentlessly repeating loop of her brilliance and my quiet, unobserved existence. When Lena decided she wanted to be a ballet dancer at 12, my parents converted the entire spare room into a dance studio for her, complete with a mirrored wall and a professional bar. When I, at 16, needed a set of advanced chemistry books for a competitive summer program, my father patted my shoulder and said, "Claire, you know we have to be careful with money. You're so resourceful. I'm sure the library has what you need." They saw Lena's fleeting passions as worthy investments in her bright future. They saw my deep-seated ambitions as solitary, inexpensive hobbies. High school only amplified the disparity. I poured myself into my studies, finding solace in the clear, measurable nature of academic success. I was the valedictorian of my graduating class. I remember coming home with the letter, my hands trembling with excitement. This, I thought, was undeniable. This was real. I found them at the dinner table. I have some news, I announced, holding up the letter. I'm the valedictorian. My father looked up from his newspaper. Well, what do you know? Good for you, Claire. My mother smiled faintly. That's lovely, dear. We'll have to get a new dress for graduation. And that was it. The conversation immediately drifted to other topics. A few minutes later, the front door slammed open and Lena burst in, her face a mask of teenage tragedy. She threw her bag on the floor and collapsed into a chair, sobbing. She'd been cast as the second understudy for the lead in the school play. For the next hour, both of our parents dedicated themselves to consoling her. They brought her tea. They stroked her hair. They told her the director was a fool who didn't recognize true talent. My valedictorian letter lay forgotten on the counter, next to a stack of mail. The college decision process was the final, brutal confirmation. Lena had her heart set on a prestigious, wildly expensive art school in New York. I had been accepted, with a partial scholarship, to a top-tier university with a renowned pre-law program. One evening, my father called me into his study to discuss finances. Claire, he began, looking uncomfortable, we've been running the numbers. Your mother and I can cover Lena's tuition. That art school is her dream, and it's important to foster. That kind of creativity. And mine? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He sighed, avoiding my eyes. Your scholarship is very generous, and you've always been so independent, so good at managing things. We know you'll be able to figure out the rest with student loans. Besides, he added, with a logic that stunned me, a law career. It's a less certain path for a woman. Very demanding. We wouldn't want you to be unhappy. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. I simply nodded, left his study, and went up to my room. I looked at my acceptance letter and my scholarship offer. They weren't gifts from my family. They were escape routes I had built for myself, word by word, grade by grade. The years that followed were a blur of work. I took on debt, I worked 3 jobs while in law school, and I barely slept. I served coffee to girls who looked like Lena, laughing and carefree, and then went to the library to study case law until my vision blurred. I called home once a week, listening to long, detailed accounts of Lena's exciting life in New York. Her gallery shows, her influential friends, her glamorous parties. I'd mention I'd made law review or won a moot court competition, and my mother would reply, "That's nice, dear," before seamlessly transitioning back to Lena. I graduated with honors. They didn't come. Lena had a critically important art installation that weekend. I sat alone in a sea of celebrating families, holding my Juris Doctor degree, and felt a familiar, hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't raw anger anymore. It was a cold, hard kind of acceptance. They were never going to see me, so I stopped trying to make them. I passed the bar, joined a respected Boston firm, and took every complex, grueling case nobody else wanted. I worked weekends, holidays, and straight through the night. I built a reputation for being meticulous, fair, and unshakable. My work was my life, a fortress of logic and purpose I had built around myself, and I was exceptionally good at it. Years later, when the governor's office called to inform me of my appointment to the Superior Court bench, I was one of the youngest judges in the history of Massachusetts, the culmination of a lifetime of quiet, relentless effort. This, I thought, holding the phone, my heart pounding. This is something they can't diminish. My hand was shaking as I dialed their number. Mom? I have some news. Claire, is everything okay? You sound breathless. Yes, everything is wonderful. I was appointed. I'm going to be a judge. There was a distinct pause on the line. I could hear the television in the background. Then she called out to my father, her voice muffled. Frank, it's Claire. On the phone. She's a judge or something. She came back to me, her tone bright but distracted. Well, congratulations, honey. That's very impressive. Listen, I have to run. Lena is in a new regional car commercial, and it's about to air. We're all gathering to watch. Talk soon? The line went dead. I stood in my silent, minimalist apartment, the city lights of Boston twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was Judge Claire Reynolds. I had reached the pinnacle of my profession, and I was still just Claire, the judge or something. I accepted it then, fully and finally. I built a life they had no part in. I had the respect of my colleagues, a purpose that filled my days, and a quiet contentment that I told myself was enough. The invitation was an assault of shimmering, cream-colored cardstock. Lena's handwriting, a perfect, loopy script, full of dramatic flourishes, announced her engagement to Mr. Ethan Hayes. An engagement party was to be held in their honor at the grand ballroom of the Bostonian Hotel. I knew I should go. It was the duty of a sister. A small, foolish part of me, a part that had proven stubbornly resistant to dying, whispered that maybe this time would be different. We were adults now, in our 30s. Perhaps the old patterns had finally faded. Called my mother to RSVP, steeling myself for the conversation. "Oh, you're coming?" she said, a note of genuine surprise in her voice that stung more than any intentional insult. "That's good. Lena will be pleased everyone is making an effort. Just try to be festive, Claire. Mingle a bit. Don't talk about your work. No one wants to hear about depressing legal cases at a party." "I'm aware of social etiquette, Mom," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "I know you are, dear. Just, it's Lena's big night. The focus should be on her. Don't overdo it. Don't overdo it." The phrase echoed in my ears after I hung up, as if my mere presence, in its quiet intensity, was an act of excess. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. I saw a woman with tired eyes but a strong jaw, and I made a decision. I wasn't going for them. I wasn't going to beg for scraps of their attention. I was going for me. I would show up, I would be polite, and I would be unapologetically myself. I had earned my place in the world, and I deserved to occupy a chair at my own sister's party. Choosing an outfit felt like preparing for battle. My closet was a sea of charcoal grays, blacks, and navy blues, a collection of tailored suits, silk blouses, and simple, elegant dresses. I had no sequins, no frills, nothing that would ever compete with Lena's sparkle. I chose a navy blue sheath dress of heavy silk. It was impeccably cut, professional, and understated. It was a uniform, my armor. It made me feel like Judge Reynolds, not just Claire, the overlooked sister. I wasn't trying to be Lena. I was doubling down on being me, the Bostonian's grand. Ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers dripped from a gilded ceiling, casting a warm, golden light over 100 guests. A string quartet played Vivaldi softly in a corner. It was a scene straight out of a magazine, perfectly curated by my mother and Lena. I saw my parents near the entrance, holding court. My mother, in a shimmering beaded gown, looked like the Queen Mother, her face glowing with a pride she only ever showed for Lena. My father stood beside her, beaming at everyone who offered congratulations. They were so absorbed in their roles as the proud parents of the bride-to-be that they didn't even see me walk in. I spotted Lena in the center of the room, the gravitational center of the party. She was a vision in a liquid silver gown that clung to her every curve. On her arm was a man who could have been designed by a committee to be the perfect fiancé. Tall, handsome, with an easy, confident smile and slicked-back dark hair. This had to be Ethan Hayes. I took a deep breath and navigated the crowd, my heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor. "Lena," I said, my voice calm. She turned, and for a fleeting second, her perfect smile faltered. It was replaced by a look of mild annoyance, the expression you give a waiter who has brought the wrong drink. "Claire, you made it," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. She gestured grandly to her fiancé. "Ethan, darling, this is my sister Claire." Ethan gave me a quick, firm handshake that was clearly a well-practiced social reflex. His eyes, a cool blue, scanned me for a fraction of a second, registered nothing of importance, and then moved on. He was already looking past me, spotting a more influential guest over my shoulder. "Good to meet you," he said perfunctorily, his attention already gone. In his world of high-stakes finance and glittering social events, I was invisible. "You look nice," Lena said, her eyes flicking over my simple dress. It wasn't a compliment. It was a classification. Safe, boring. She categorized me and dismissed me in the same breath. "Go get a drink. Mingle." With that, she turned her back, and the circle of her admirers closed, seamlessly erasing the space where I had been standing. I spent the next hour as a satellite, orbiting the periphery of the celebration. I got a glass of sparkling water and stood by a window, watching the familiar dance of social maneuvering. Aunts and uncles who had known me my entire life gave me vague, pleasant smiles, but made no move to talk to me. I was a known quantity, the quiet, serious one, the conversation killer. Dinner was a masterclass in social hierarchy. I was seated at a table in the back, near the clatter of the kitchen doors, with a few distant cousins and a great aunt who had her hearing aid turned off. My parents, Lena and Ethan, were at the head table, the royal family, bathed in the warm glow of laughter and adoration. Throughout the meal, Lena held the rapt attention of her table, telling stories. I knew her rhythms, and I could tell from her animated gestures and the delighted shrieks of her friends that she was on a roll. Then, I heard my name, her voice carried across the room. And there was this one time, she began, pausing for dramatic effect. The high school prom was coming up, and my mom bought me the most beautiful dress. Everyone was so excited. But Claire? She pointed a perfectly manicured finger vaguely in my direction. She locked herself in her room for an entire week to study for some nerdy exam. She actually told my parents that prom was a frivolous and inefficient allocation of time. The head table roared with laughter. I felt my cheeks burn. She had twisted the memory into a caricature. She left out that the exam was for the scholarship that paid for my first year of college, the scholarship our father had said I would need to figure out. She painted me as a social freak, a robot devoid of normal teenage feelings. She wasn't done. She was always like that, married to her textbooks. I don't think she even had a real boyfriend until she was like 30. More laughter. I gripped my fork under the table, my knuckles turning white. I stared down at my plate, focusing on the intricate floral pattern of the china. I could feel the pitying glances of the cousins at my table. I practiced the emotional control I had perfected over a lifetime. I took a slow, deep breath, held it, and released it. I kept my expression perfectly, placidly neutral. Showing emotion was a sign of weakness in my family. It was blood in the water. Then came the toasts. One by one, Lena's friends stood up, sharing glowing, tearful anecdotes. My father delivered a heartfelt speech about his beautiful, brilliant daughter, who had always made him so proud. He spoke of her creativity, her spirit, her ability to light up any room she entered. He meant Lena, of course. He never once glanced in my direction. Finally, Lena herself rose, a glass of champagne held delicately in her hand. A hush fell over the ballroom. She was radiant, a princess in her castle, surveying her kingdom. She thanked everyone for coming. She gushed about how deliriously happy she was, how Ethan was the most wonderful man alive, how her life was a perfect dream come true. Then, her eyes scanned the room and found me at my remote table in the back. A sly, cruel smirk played on her lips, one I knew all too well. It was the look she got just before she went in for the kill. I also want to toast my big sister Claire, she said. The spotlight operator, assuming this was a tender sisterly moment, swiveled a bright, warm beam of light directly onto my table. Suddenly, I was illuminated, pinned against the darkness. I felt like an animal caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. Claire has always been the serious one in the family, Lena continued, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sympathy that is more insulting than any direct attack. While I was out living life and having fun, she was always buried in some dusty old book. She's incredibly smart, of course. She paused, letting the faint praise hang in the air, before twisting the knife. So here's to my sister Claire. May she one day find a life outside her dusty courthouse files. The room erupted in chuckles. It wasn't overtly malicious laughter. It was the easy, polite amusement of people at a party, comfortable in their shared understanding of family archetypes. There was the fun one, and there was the boring one. They were laughing with Lena, at me. She had taken my life's work, the years of sacrifice, the relentless dedication, the one thing that was entirely mine, and reduced it to a punchline. She had publicly branded me as a sad, lonely spinster, married to her job because she couldn't find anything better. I forced a smile onto my face. It felt like a porcelain mask, stretched so tight it was about to crack. I was prepared to endure it, to just sit there and take it until the spotlight moved away and I could fade back into the background. But then, across the room, I saw Ethan. He wasn't laughing. He had frozen mid-sip, his champagne glass hovering near his lips. His charming smile was gone, wiped clean from his face, and replaced by an expression of utter disbelief. The spotlight that held me in its glare was also illuminating me for him, and it was clear he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the very first time. I watched his eyes widen. I saw the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly white. He leaned toward Lena, who was still basking in the glow of her joke, and whispered something urgently. I couldn't hear the words, but from across the room, I could read his lips with perfect clarity. Claire? Her name is Claire Reynolds? Lena nodded, a flicker of confusion on her face at his sudden, intense reaction. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was rapidly escalating into panic. Then he spoke, his voice a low, strangled whisper, but in the sudden silence of the room, it cut through the air like a siren. "Wait, Claire Reynolds? Judge Reynolds?" The laughter died instantly, sputtering out into a strange, confused stillness. Everyone turned to look at him, then back at me. My sister's triumphant smirk crumbled, replaced by a mask of complete bewilderment. The carefully constructed atmosphere of the party had just shattered. The power in the room, which had been pooled around the head table for the entire night, had just shifted, and it was moving like a tidal wave right toward my forgotten table. In the back, in the sudden, heavy silence, 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. The spotlight still held me in its unforgiving glare. For the first time in my life, when my family and their friends looked at me, they weren't looking through me. They were seeing me, and they were hanging on my next word. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to show emotion. I had presided over tense courtrooms where a single word could decide a person's fate. This was no different. I met Ethan's panicked gaze from across the ballroom. "That's correct," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and clear. It was my courtroom voice, a voice that carried authority without needing volume. Ethan looked like he had been physically struck. He started stammering, his usual smooth confidence completely deserting him. The SEC case? The one with the Northgate Investment Group?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. "Yes," I said, my expression unchanging. "That one." Collective gasp went through the room. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like the rushing of wind before a storm. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. You could hear the clink of a fork being dropped onto a plate 2 tables away. Guests were staring, their mouths agape. The fairy tale prince, the perfect fiancé, was suddenly not so perfect. He was a defendant in a major fraud case, and his future sister-in-law, the boring one he had ignored all night, was the judge who held his entire future in her hands. Ethan dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the polished floor, the sound unnaturally loud and violent in the silent ballroom. I have to go," he muttered, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He didn't look at Lena. He didn't look at anyone. He turned and practically ran from the room, pushing past a stunned waiter and disappearing. Through the grand doors, Lena was frozen for a long moment, her face a tragic canvas of shock, humiliation, and dawning horror. Her perfect party, her perfect announcement, her perfect life. It was all collapsing in a spectacularly public fashion. "Ethan, wait!" she finally cried out, her voice shrill with panic. She hitched up her expensive silver gown and ran after him, her princess-like grace gone, replaced by the raw, clumsy desperation of someone whose world had just been pulled out from under them. The moment they were gone, the ballroom exploded into a frenzy of hushed, excited chatter. Everyone was talking at once. People were pulling out their phones, fingers flying across screens as they Googled Ethan Hayes' fraud case. The relatives who had chuckled condescendingly at Lena's joke were now looking at me with a new, startling expression, a mixture of awe, confusion, and a healthy dose of fear. My parents looked utterly shell-shocked. My father's face was ashen, and my mother was staring at my empty seat as if it were a throne she had never known existed. I calmly, deliberately, placed my linen napkin on the table beside my untouched plate of food. I stood up, my back straight, my movements measured. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't look at any of the stunned, whispering guests. I turned and walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, the sound of my sensible heels clicking. On the marble floor, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic murmurings I was leaving behind. I didn't need to flee like Ethan or chase like Lena. I could simply depart. In the end, all I had ever needed was my name. The aftermath was swift and merciless. By the next morning, the juicy story of the engagement party implosion had already rippled through Boston's high society. Ethan's fraud case, which had been a quiet, complex story relegated to the business section, was suddenly front-page news, complete with a dramatic new human interest angle. The headlines were sensational. Banker's fiancé's sister is judge in his $1 million fraud trial. The first thing I did when I got to my chambers was file the paperwork to recuse myself from the case. It was an absolute necessity. The conflict of interest was a chasm. My duty to the law was paramount, and my personal connection, however fraught, made my impartiality impossible. But in the court of public opinion, The damage to Ethan was already done. The scandal painted him not just as a potential criminal, but as a fool. His investors grew nervous. His firm launched an internal investigation. Within a week, his engagement to Lena was officially, and very publicly, terminated. Lena's perfect dream had become a public nightmare. My phone, usually silent outside of work hours, began to ring. It was the first time in years that members of my extended family had sought me out for any reason other than a perfunctory holiday greeting. My Aunt Carol, a woman whose primary interactions with me involved pinching my cheek and asking if I was eating enough, was the first to call. "Claire, dear," she began, her voice syrupy sweet and utterly insincere. "I was just thinking about you. We were all so terribly impressed with you the other night. Such poise. I always told your mother, that Claire, she's the smart one. She's going places. You just have this quiet strength about you." I held the phone to my ear, listening without saying a word. I vividly remembered her laughing, her head thrown back in delight at Lena's toast. "Thank you for calling, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice polite and distant. I offered no details, no gossip. The conversation quickly withered, and she hung up, audibly frustrated. A few days later, my parents appeared at my apartment door unannounced. They looked haggard and stressed, aged a decade in a week. "Claire, we need to talk," my father said, walking past me into my living room as if he still held parental authority there. "You have ruined your sister's life," my mother began. Immediately, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "Her wedding is off. She won't come out of her room. That boy, Ethan, he was her future. He was from a good family." I looked at them, standing awkwardly in the middle of my clean, orderly apartment, and I felt a profound sense of detachment. The old ache, the desperate, childish longing for their approval, was simply gone. It had been cauterized and burned away in the heat of that ballroom spotlight. "I did nothing," I said, my voice as calm and measured as if I were issuing a ruling. "Lena made her toast. Ethan made his business decisions. I simply existed. You were always jealous of her," my mother cried, her voice rising. "You couldn't stand to see her happy, so you ruined it. You should have just kept quiet about who you were." The absurdity of her accusation was almost breathtaking. "Kept quiet?" I asked, a humorless smile touching my lips. "You've spent my entire life wishing I was someone else, someone more like Lena, and the one night I am exactly and publicly who I am, you blame me for it. Lena mocked my job, my life, my very identity. It turns out my identity mattered. That's not my fault. It's not jealousy, it's irony." They stared at me, dumbfounded. It was as if I were a stranger speaking a foreign language they couldn't comprehend. The narrative they had maintained for 35 years, of Lena the star and Claire the shadow, had been shattered, and they had no alternative script to follow. They left my apartment that day in a cloud of confused resentment, and I knew that something fundamental and irreparable had broken between us. In the months that followed, a quiet, profound peace settled over my life. My work was my sanctuary, a world of order and reason that stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos of my family. In my courtroom, I was respected. The law was clear, the facts were objective, and justice was the ultimate goal. My life was orderly, logical, and entirely my own. I didn't hear from Lena, but I heard about her. She had quit her job in public relations and moved back into her old bedroom in our parents' house. According to the family grapevine, she was devastated and inconsolable. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Hello?" A choked, watery voice responded. "Claire?" It was Lena. It was the first time we had spoken since the night of the party. "My life is ruined," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a torrent of self-pity. "Everything is gone. My friends are laughing at me. Ethan won't even take my calls. I can't go anywhere without people whispering, 'This is all your fault.'" I leaned back against my kitchen counter, listening as she poured out all her anger and pain. She blamed me for her humiliation, for Ethan's deception, for her shattered dreams. It was the same narrative our parents had tried to force on me. When she finally ran out of breath, her sobs subsiding into ragged gasps, there was a long, humming silence on the line. The old Claire, the sister who had spent her life trying to keep the peace, would have apologized. She would have tried to fix it, to soothe the hurt feelings, to take the blame just to make it all go away. But I was not the old Claire anymore. I took a deep breath, and when I spoke, My voice was not angry, or gloating, or cold. It was simply the voice of truth. Lena, I said, for our entire lives, you, Mom, and Dad put me in a box. I was the boring one, the quiet one, the one whose life and accomplishments were always less important than your feelings. At your party, you stood up in front of 100 people and you mocked me for who I am. You belittled my life's work for a cheap laugh. I paused, letting the words sink in. But who I am turned out to matter. She started to cry again, a different kind of sound this time, a wounded, guttural sob of someone who is beginning to understand a painful truth. I'm not sorry for what happened, I continued, my voice gentle but firm. I am truly sorry that you are in pain. But your life isn't ruined because of me. It was just built on a foundation that wasn't as solid as you believed. I didn't yell. I didn't dredge up the spelling bees, the proms, the decades of casual dismissals. I didn't need to. The truth, spoken plainly and without malice, was enough. For the first time, I felt a sense of complete closure. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't revenge. It was a quiet, clean release. I have to go, Lena, I said softly, and I ended the call. I walked to my large window, looking out at the city I had made my home. The lights of Boston twinkled back at me, a vast and beautiful constellation of possibilities. I no longer needed a seat at their table. I had finally learned how to build my own. Have you ever been mocked by family, only for the truth to flip? Everything? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of betrayal, survival, and poetic justice, because sometimes dignity speaks louder than revenge.